Welcome to the Summer Science Surge. I'm Elise and I'm from Keystone Science. I'm very excited to share with you my plan for my first week in my classroom when I go back to school in August. My back to school strategy is a strategic approach so that I can build norms, skills, and community in my science classroom while my students get used to the processes and procedures of the classroom. So, a little bit about me before we get started. I've been in the classroom for over 10 years. I currently teach biology in Pennsylvania, and I am the curriculum leader and writer within my district. I'm also the founder of Keystone Science, where I share my high quality, highly engaging NGSS aligned products with busy science teachers like you. So, the first week of school is a really important time. I'm sure I don't need to tell you that this first week is going to set the entire tone for the year. It's going to communicate very quickly to your students what you care about as a teacher. And it's also going to help build your student confidence in the science classroom and build the culture within the classroom. I really like to use the first week to practice skills and behaviors within the classroom, skills that I know my students are going to need to be successful in our biology curriculum, and also the behaviors or the routines and procedures that I am going to expect them to do repeatedly during classroom activities. I'm spending the first 5 days of my school year. We're on a traditional schedule, 45-minute periods. And I like to invest all of this time early in the year to save time later in the year. I'm starting slow so that I can go fast when I'm in content and need to move. So my very first day, I completely stole this activity from another participant of our collaboration this summer, Big Red Science. This QR code will take you to a page where it will directly link to Big Red Science's blog post where she writes about the polar bear inquiry. And I believe she's also talking about it in her video. So if you want to pop over and see her video, if you haven't already, she's going to talk about it there too. But day one, my students walk into the room and I present them with this inquiry activity where I tell them that um, they are going to get two dice in their group and they have to figure out the rules. Basically, how do I know how many polar bears and fish they have depending on the roll of the dice? If you're intrigued, check out the blog post. The reason why I like to do this on day one is because it's a really good icebreaker. I think traditional icebreakers are really for they're in like large groups for the class, and they can just be really boring and really monotonous. And I really want to grab my students' attention and get them excited about what they're going to be doing in my class right away. So they're going to be working in groups of 4 in my classroom, or 3, depending on how many dice and students you have in your room. And it's a small group exercise. So they're probably going to walk in. If you don't have assigned seats, they're probably going to sit with people that they already know, which is fine. That the goal here is to get them to talk to one another, encourage them to ask questions about what they are seeing, what I am telling them as far as how many polar bears and fish there are. And it also introduces the idea of this phenomena based learning model that we use in my district. I also really like this because it is a low floor activity, meaning anyone can get involved. And it gets students doing the skills that I'm expecting them to do in my classroom on day one. Things like asking questions, collecting data, and also noticing patterns in those data. Now, at the end of the activity, because they usually figure they don't need an entire 45-minute period to figure this out, I do like to debrief with them. And I like to give them whiteboards so that they can jot down the data and also observations that they are making to try to figure out the rules. So at the end, when we debrief as a small group and then we share out as a large class, what skills did their group need to be successful in finding out the rules that I was using to find the number of polar bears and fish? And then I asked them, how would you model the steps you took to solve the problem? So now I'm asking them to almost come up with the scientific method, generically asking, well, how would you model? What did you do as a group to try to figure out the problem? And have them draft that up on their board. And then I want to follow up with what is good etiquette when you're working in the group. So thinking back to this activity, what happened in your group that hindered the group's progress to solving the problem, or what happened in the group that actually catapulted you to find the solution, or worked really well? And then the last thing of reflection is, what would you change to be successful or more successful the next time you would do a similar activity? And again, this is getting them used to working in groups, because I do more group work than anything else in my science classroom. So they need to be comfortable working with their peers, talking with their peers, and even having this reflection process with their peers so that they are comfortable calling each other out in the classroom if they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. On day 2, I have them come in and we do a class norms and expectations activity. I use 8 large whiteboards set up around the room. They're movable, so I just put them wherever I want them. And each station is going to have a sentence starter, and the students are going to write the ending of the sentence starter on Post-it notes, and then they're going to put all their Post-it notes for the same sentence starter on the same board. And I really like doing this activity because it gives the students a collective input on how we are running the classroom and what the norms are and the expectations are for the classroom. And they can also see, because one of the sentence stems has to do with their goal for the year, a lot of students have the same goal. And knowing that they have similar goals, they're working towards those goals together, they're more likely to support one another in the classroom if they see that they have similar goals, and even expectations of peers. Another one is, what does a good classmate or group mate do? What does a good teacher do? What an effective teacher? So that gives me insight on what their expectations are for me at the very beginning. And it also introduces the movement of groups around the room. I do a lot of circuits at groups, and they're supposed to rotate around the room to the different stations. This introduces that procedure to my students. And because we are doing phenomena-based NGSS aligned units, we have driving question boards that we use in every unit. So this is also introducing the idea of a driving question board and how we add to it and how we group similar things together and then share out with the rest of the class what we see. And I like to take the response from my students after this day 2 activity and create a classroom norms, like little poster using the themes from all my classes. I don't just use single classes. I have 5 classes this coming. So I get all those themes together, create a little norms poster, create an expectations poster, and hang it prominently in my classroom. And on day 3, I refer to it and I say, these are the norms and expectations that were collective from yesterday. So this is how we are going to be acting and behaving in this classroom. Again, that QR code will take you to a page that will send you a link directly to this, a slide deck of this activity. It's very straightforward. Each student just needs some Post-it notes, and you need to provide each group an index card. And by the end of the period, you will have a really good idea of what your class expects of you, what they expect of themselves and of each other. And if you do this well and station yourself at one of the boards, you will have the opportunity to talk to every single student in your class during this activity as well. So those are my first 2 days. I would say those are the most important days because they really set the expectations as far as what students can expect in my class that year. And then the last 3 days, days 3, 4, and 5, we're doing science skills. I'm not telling them as soon as they walk in the room, hey, we're going to do graphing today. No, I am like sneaking these things in to activities or real world data that I have. So something that is engaging to my students, has worked in the past, or even from day 1 and 2, I'm talking to students, I'm figuring out what their interests are. Last year, I had a class with some students that were really into Rubik's Cubes. So I figured something out that would get them engaged in the Rubik's Cube thing. And if it works for one class and I want to do it in another class where I don't know if they're into Rubik's Cubes, the fact that it's not science related, they'll think it's the best thing ever. So when I'm designing these activities for days 3, 4, and 5, I am targeting skills that are required for my very first unit. I don't want the first unit that these students do to be the first time I'm asking them to do some of these science skills. So a couple of the things that they even did on day 1 and 2 are skills that are going to be important, not just for the whole year, but they are specifically important for unit 1. So for example, I want to make sure that they can interpret a graph and different kinds of graphs, a line graph versus a bar graph. And sometimes we have graphs that have multiple axes. So there's two y-axes, for example. Are they going to be able to interpret that information in that graph? That's very important. Also, if I give them a data set, are they going to be able to tell me what kind of graph to make? Usually it's going to be a line graph or a bar graph. And are they going to be able to identify the parts of a graph that they need to include when they are creating the data, so that if someone looks at that graph, they know what they're looking at without having the data table in front of them. I also do a very broad overview of CER writing. A lot of my short answer questions on assessments are in the CER format. So I start to introduce this idea of the CER to support the conclusions or answers that they want to give me in labs, in class, on assessments. I also like to get a little bit into scientific method. I don't call it the scientific method, but I give them some opportunities to design investigations, not that they actually carry them out. But if I give them a problem or a question and I ask them, okay, so what is going to be your independent variable if you were to do this? What's your dependent variable? What's the procedure that you would write out? What are some controls, things that you need to keep constant in order to make sure that this independent variable is affecting what we're measuring? And then I like to do vocabulary. I really like to teach root words, prefixes, and suffixes, because there's a lot of vocab in biology, and it can be really difficult, if not impossible, for some students to memorize vocab terms and their definitions. So if I just give them, I think I have a list of 20 or 30 prefix, suffix, root words, and I continuously refer back to those things as we teach new vocabulary. If they can just hang on to what some of those root words mean, and they come across a word that they don't know on an assessment or our end of course exam, if they know a part of that word and what that part means, they have a higher chance of getting that question correct on the assessment. So I really like to teach those root word, prefix, suffix parts, and the ones that are important specifically to biology. And I said this at the beginning, it bears repeating, all the activities on days 4, 5, and 3, 4, and 5 rather, it should feel like real science. And if feels like real science to the students, they're going to be really engaged with it. It's not going to look like sitting down for a lecture on the steps of the scientific method and then giving them a scenario and having them identify what's the independent and dependent variable, what are some controls they need to consider. You need to give them real world scenarios, local things that are happening in their town, and try to get them to make meaning and draw conclusions from that. You can even go way out of left field and grab some current event stuff or things that are just shocking as far as graphs or data that you've seen in the news recently. Try to pull all of that in. It doesn't even have to be a fully fleshed out lesson. If you just have a graph from a news article, throw it up on the board and have them make some notes. What do you notice? What do you see on this graph? What is it measuring? What questions do you have about the data on this graph? That can be very simple, but also a very powerful lesson that gets them thinking about scientific literacy as well. So these resources that I mentioned that I use in the first 5 days of my science classroom, they are at this QR code. There are a couple of other resources that I included from my store that might give you a jumping off point, especially for those science skill days. I have a graphing practice and a checklist for what makes a good graph. This is going to include a checklist for a graph that students are making on paper, but also a checklist and instructions for making a graph using Excel. And that's what I have my students do a lot of. So I included that in that graphing practice. I also have a lot of scientific method resources. It's not on the slide, but on the QR code, I do have a PowerPoint for the scientific method, even though I said no lecture. You can still use it as a reference or refer your students to it if they're not sure. And along with the scientific method, I have a paper towel inquiry lab where students are tasked with the question of which paper towel absorbs best, because we know school paper towels don't absorb anything. So they're able to test different brands of paper towel to see which is the best brand of paper towel. And again, that's up it's completely inquiry based. They are deciding what determines the best paper towel, and they're testing for that variable. I also have some great CER practice scenarios where it's giving them the 3 sections CER, and one of those sections is blank. So if they are given the claim and given the evidence, they should be able to write the reasoning for that scenario. Or if I give them the evidence and reasoning, they should be writing a claim. So it gets them familiar with what is expected in each section of a CER. And then the last one is those root words that I mentioned. I have a language of science practice worksheet and reference sheet. I always print out the reference sheet on a colored cardstock, so it's thicker, so it lasts the year, and it's also a color. So when I ask them to pull it out of their folder or binder, they're just looking for a specific color and not all of the white papers that might be there. So that's another resource that you can use in your classroom. And that's all available at this QR code. Now, to wrap up, I said this before, but I'm going to bullet point here. So for you, the teacher, doing these 5 days at the beginning of the school year gives you a really great formative assessment of where your incoming students currently are with their science skills, with their content knowledge. And it also gives you the opportunity to sit back and observe the classroom dynamics. What students are leading, what students are following, what students are the active participants that are writing everything down in their notebook, and which ones are just sitting back waiting for someone else to write something and then trying to copy what they wrote. Also, the social interactions. You are going to very quickly see which students cannot focus when they are paired with one another, and you may want to consider separating them if you don't assign seats right away. Also, practice makes permanent. You cannot start procedures too soon in the school year, and doing them over and over again is only going to save you time later in the school year. So working in a group, what does that look like? What does a successful group look like? What is the procedure of working in a group? How are you moving from your desk to the lab tables? How are you moving between the stations and the lab tables when we are rotating around the room? How are we handling materials? Some things I do in the first few days are looking at lab equipment. So what is the appropriate way to do that? The sooner you do that and the more that you do it initially, the more it's going to become habit for your students, and you will not need to reteach or remind these procedures by the end of the first month of school. Now, this also benefits your students. A lot of students are really intimidated by science, and just the fact that it is a science class, they think it's difficult and hard, and they're going to do terrible. So that, especially that day 1 and day 2 activity, these are very low pressure, high comfort types of activities. They are not content based. They are not performing or speaking in front of an entire class, so they don't have that peer pressure or the anxiety of speaking in front of everybody on the first day of school. They are just working in small groups. And in the case of my day 2 activity, they are writing anonymously on a Post-it note. So there is no pressure there. So it gets them engaged in the class right away and gives them the confidence that they need. It also gives students practice with either tech tools, navigating the classroom, and finding supplies around the room. So by letting them move around and discover what is in the room, you don't have to go on your own little tour like on the first day. So it gives them the opportunity as they're rotating stations or as they are moving around to look at the different whiteboards to just kind of notice things around them and where things are in the classroom. And it also gives a really good opportunity to build community within the classroom before those high stakes content based activities come in the first unit. So they're getting comfortable with one another and they are learning who is in the class, because that's really important. Because for me personally, last year and this year, I have mixed ninth and 10th grade biology classes. So they may not know each other because they are in different grades. And we also have very large class sizes as far as the graduating class. So they may not even know people in their same class. So it gives them the opportunity to see who's in the room, learn some names, and become comfortable with them before we are doing these high stakes unit content based things. And your foundational skills, those science skills, again, just reviewing what they probably have already done in middle school and doing things that you've identified as the teacher as being important for the first unit. And then the other stuff will kind of come along as you go through the school year. So it's going to give them confidence and remind them about those foundational skills that they already have that are going to help them be successful in your class. And then the expectations part, that day 2 activity is paramount to getting your entire class to buy in to the norms and expectations, because they are basically creating them on those boards. And I am simply taking what they've written and putting it onto a poster, and it is hanging, and we refer to it all year. These are our norms in the classroom, and these are the expectations that we have of everyone, me included as the teacher. Also, this really helps with classroom management, because you have that repeated movement of routines as far as moving into groups, rotating with groups, maybe going to get a pencil or going to get a piece of paper. That is going to make things go a lot more smoothly when you need it to during the year, especially during lab days. You do not want to waste time on lab days. It also gives student agency from the very first day, as far as they're responsible for themselves and they're responsible for their own learning. I am doing little, if any, lecture that first week of school. The only thing that I am doing in front of the entire class is saying hi at the beginning of the period, giving them instructions for what we are going to be accomplishing, and then sending them off into their groups. So it's going to become clear very quickly that I am not the type of teacher to just stand in front of the room and so that they can sit there passively and just do nothing. It also gives them immediate practice. A lot of teachers I've seen in the past and in other content areas, they spend the first week kind of going through, okay, this is the syllabus day 1. I'm going to give you a pre-assessment on day 2, and then on day 3 we're going to do an icebreaker, and then on day 4 we're going to do another icebreaker, and then we might do another like formative so I can see where you are with writing or something like that. But with this strategy, you're getting them into content right away. And it's not as formalized, even though you are basically doing the same thing as that teacher in the other instance, going through everything step by step. It also establishes trust and expectations really early on in the year. And that I cannot emphasize enough. If you do not get these kids on day 1, the first week of school, to buy in, to know what the procedures are, it's really hard to reel them back in later. It's not impossible, but it is really hard. So you establish those expectations and you are very firm with the expected procedures and how things run in your classroom up front. I let very few behavior issues slide the first week of school. I am very strict, and that's not my personality. I'm a pretty fun teacher, but I do not let things go at the very beginning of the year because I want them to know what I accept and what I do not accept. And after, the first month or so, maybe sometimes the first marking period, I don't even have to comment on their behavior anymore because they know coming into my room, I am not going to accept the fact that someone walked past their desk to go mess with their friend before they got to their desk when they walked in the morning. Like, that's not okay with me. You come in, you go to your desk, you get to work. There are no detours. And there's a lot of pushback as far as, well, we have so little time and so much content to cover. And I have an end of course exam that I need to get through everything before that. And I get it. I do too. But I am a huge, huge believer in investing time up front at the beginning of the year. So starting slow in order to go fast later in the year, because you will have such an incredible foundation for procedures and expectations and the skills that your students need to be successful in your class, that long-term gains, you're going to have a smooth year, because your pacing is going to be more efficient as you go through the year. Students get used to it. And if they are exposed to it right away, it's going to be second nature before the second week of school. It's going to give your students stronger ownership of their own learning because they know what is expected of them, and they will come in and they'll be like, oh, we're doing a CER. I know a CER, and you don't have to even reteach or anything. They know what they're supposed to do. It also, in an inquiry-based classroom, like a lot of science classrooms are, it's a more authentic inquiry process than when you're in a content-heavy unit. You don't have to go back and reteach things. You can actually have an authentic inquiry conversation with your students instead of going back and reteaching. Now, remember when we learned about asking questions earlier, you're constantly modeling it and you're constantly giving them feedback from the beginning. So you do get authentic inquiry. They know how to ask questions. They know how to look at a graph and interpret what they are seeing. So my mantra is, this is not lost time. It is strategic planning. The NGSS standards and three-dimensional learning thrive in a prepared classroom. And this first week scaffolding that I shared with you is going to lay that foundation. So this isn't lost time. It may feel like lost time to some people that don't buy into this because you're not doing content right away and you're losing a week. But setting this foundation is going to keep you from having to rebuild and reteach throughout the year. It is going to save you time in the long term. So as you start thinking about your first week back to school, I know it's hard to hard to face the facts that we're going to have to go back soon. But I want you to think about what routines or skills in your classroom are important throughout the year, especially in Unit 1, that you can work in fun practice during the first week of school. And then I want you to think about, how do you balance content versus procedures? So I used to teach the characteristics of life at the beginning of the year. I still kind of do. But now, instead of being concerned about my students learning and memorizing those characteristics of life, I'm more concerned about the procedures that they're doing during that process. I used to do, it was an inquiry activity where I'd give them a specimen and they had to tell me if it was living or non-living. And then it was like a CER exercise. So I was more concerned about, okay, how well are they making these observations? How well are they analyzing those observations to connect to the topic? And then how well are they formulating their evidence and reasoning so that they can prove to us as a class that this thing is living or non-living? So when you are looking at your content versus procedures in the first week, consider the goal of the activity. Do you want them to know the content you're teaching, or do you want them to be proficient in the process or the skill? The endpoint is not always content. The endpoint can very well be the skill that you want them to take away from it. So I want to thank you so much for tuning into this video. I hope it was really helpful for your planning for the beginning of the school year. Please reach out to me. I have a website. I also have an Instagram. It's not on here, but it's on that resource QR code. And feel free to email me at any point. On that resource page, you'll have a link to the polar bear inquiry activity, a link to a Canva slide deck of my day 2 norms and expectations activity, and some links to other science skill resources that will help you be successful in the first week of school. Good luck.